First of all, I want to get away from the dictionary definition of a constitution. A constitution must have purpose, and the purpose must be to create a nation that conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We've got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again. My name is Tracy Can, and you're tuned in to Globespan 24x7. We are live from the studio here in Richmond Hills, Queens, New York. And I am joined in studio by, he's no stranger to the political arena, Mr. Clinton Erlin. He is the CEO of German's Restaurant and also a civil society activist. And joining me via Skype from Trinidad is Chevy Devonish. He is a law student. He was also a lecturer at the University of Guyana, and he worked with the Starbrook News. And from Guyana, I have Vishal Joseph, president of Move On Guyana, Inc. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you for having me.
Definitely. It's a pleasure to have you all on board. And before we move on, we cannot forget the fathers. We'd like to just say a happy Father's Day to all of the wonderful fathers around the world and the ones who are tuned into the program watching. So our topic today is youths and the political landscape. Now I have Mr. Erling in studio with me, so I'm going to start and I'll direct my first question to him, and of course we will all dialogue. But what are your thoughts on our political landscape currently?
Well, I'll just speak on the political landscape and then extrapolate maybe later on where we insert the youth into the whole equation. The political landscape in Guyana has not changed much, let's say, since independence. And we've always had some of the same issues that occurred then. They're still present today, and they proliferate the entire landscape there. You find these two predominantly big parties, which controls the entire narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is based on ethnic insecurities and ethnic loyalties between these two major competing parties. We've had attempts at third parties, but the third parties at times would form coalition governments with the two big ones. And not much has changed in the sense that you see the zero-sum game playing out, where one side has to win at all times whenever it comes to policy decisions. And one side feels as though, like, I have all the solutions for Guyana, and the other side, likewise, would feel they have all the solutions. When it comes to elections, we drum up that ethnic insecurities, and the people believe, and the message that goes out into the global arena is that Guyana has this racial problem. It is something that has stymied the growth of Guyana. It has discouraged investors from coming into the country to invest, and it has also created a disillusioned youth population in terms when it comes to politics. And in fact, lots of the youth today would say that, look, I want to stay away from politics. I don't want anything to do with politics. And people see politics, unfortunately, back home as an arena, something that you should stay away from and be fearful of.
As against getting involved and being a part of the solution and having your voice heard. Vishal, your thoughts on our current political landscape?
Great. So I'll address what Clinton said about youth a bit, after. But essentially, my thoughts are that Guyana has not seen a true breed of statesmen pushing themselves forward to ensure the national development of this country. What we've had are politicians who look at 5-year cycles and ensuring that they're in power for the next 5 years and 5 after that and 5 after that, as opposed to those who make warranted and clear-cut decisions that, might not necessarily go with the flow of the general population, but are essentially for the better of the country. As it relates to what Clinton said about youth, I will agree with him that youth are disillusioned and disenchanted, but that has a that is actually a two-factor situation, rather. So the first factor would have been for the past, let's say maybe 20 to 30 years, young people have been chastised and denigrated for political commentary. You would have been told, and I've experienced that myself, to choose a side, and there's no place for objectivity and for walking that political midline. And if you chose that path, you might have been castigated and whatnot. The second factor therein would, of course, be broken political promises. Various parties, they come up with all the promises that they want young people to come out and vote for them, and they'll get this and they'll get that. And of course, we understand that there are some genuinely extenuating situations and factors that might prevent a government from fulfilling all of its promises. However, at the very least, youth seem to think at this point that they're just tokens in a game of chess.
Chevy?
Going last, the other members of the panel have touched on much of the reality in Guyana. We have to consider several things: the political parties in Guyana, the system on which Guyana is erected. That is the fact that we have a largely two-party system which allows for back and forth competition between these two political parties. You have very minimum room for a third or even a fourth force, if that is possible. The systems of parity, paramountcy, which is evident not just by the loyalty that you see members displaying who are part of the parties, but even in our laws. So you have a system in Guyana based on a political party system that is very divisive and drives people in two distinct directions. Where youth are concerned, based on my own observations, my interactions with youth, and having taught young people for a few years at the University of Guyana, one of the things that I realized is it's not just that they have been denigrated or criticized, as Vishal has said, and that they're disillusioned, but Guyana does not foster an educational culture to teach young people that, by and large, to teach young people that what happens in the political system is important to them, it will affect them, and therefore they have a stake and therefore an interest in participating in that system. Simply studying politics is something that is seen as abominable to many young people, and they just do it because they have to get the grade and they leave, which is why one of the things that I try to promote is civic education, so that you learn exactly what the system is, why the system is important, and why your participation of that system is important. So I think that one of the reasons that we find young people not as participants, even though I think that has changed substantially over the years, is that they are not taught. And even though that is responsible, and even though I think that young people need to take some amount of responsibility for their lack of participation, I do think that the system which creates and which educates young people does not foster that interest and that sense of ownership and participation.
Just to build on what Chevy's saying here, we cannot have a discussion on views of the political landscape. I would offer to say that the topic probably should have been the state of youth in Guyana, because you'll have to bring in the other dimensions that would affect the political. including you look at the economy. You don't see participation of young people a lot in business, in entrepreneurship. Lots of factors for that. You look at the unemployment rate. I heard
At what level, though, Clinton, to say that we don't see participation of youths in entrepreneurship? Because I will disagree to an extent with you when it comes to level. I see a lot of young people who are going into not just makeup stream, the photography, videography, and because there's unemployment, it's a real issue. They have to create opportunities for themselves, and a lot of young people are doing so.
Entrepreneurship is, look, I hold entrepreneurship dear to me, and it's a great means for anybody to uplift themselves beyond going in traditional employment positions. In Guyana, unfortunately, for young people to succeed, they might have the creativity, they might have the ideas, and this does not proliferate throughout the entire country. You might see the bulk of this coming from Georgetown and in those the centers, the urban centers. But when you go into rural centers, it's something different. But you look at banks. Banks look at young people as skeptical when they approach them for loans. If you want to grow and expand your enterprise, financing is crucial and critical. The banking system, because you're young, you don't have the experience, you're higher risk. The banks won't even pay you attention. So there is that deterrent for kids, for young people to get into entrepreneurships. True. You look in the boardrooms, you don't see lots of young people in boardrooms, especially in larger companies. Again, and then you spoke about the unemployment rate. Department that you just said, 40%. But based on, Guyana and stats, I don't trust any of that because, the Bureau of Stats doesn't have their stuff in order. But you look at throughout the Caribbean, it's a Caribbean problem. You look at 25% and 40% unemployment rate. That's where youths aren't getting into the system, and instead of thinking about politics, everybody's looking at their own survival. And survival for most people is the financial bottom line. We look at sports. You go to sports. We don't create enough of the facilities in Guyana for kids to get involved in sports. Everybody sees sports as, it's trivial, it's just about having fun. But sports builds lots of character, it builds, leadership skills, it teaches creativity, discipline, and there's a whole host of other things. And then we look at the social ills with youth in Guyana, and the Caribbean in general. Suicide is high in Guyana. The crime rate, in fact, recently I heard the CARICOM Secretary General say, hey, 80% of crime across the region, prosecuted crime, occurs from youths below the age of 30. And that is a damning figure when you hear it. But a lot of again, you can't separate one from the other because one contributes to the other. And then you look at the primary unit, we call it the primary unit in the society, the family. Lots of kids are having kids at a very young age. Their parents did not instill in them some of the right values or some of the values to be successful in life and in society, and so that cycle continues and continues, and it is perpetuated over and over, and that's why we're here. In terms of the political landscape and youths getting involved in politics, for me, from the older folks, a lot of this is cultural, psychological, and sociological. We, in our country, there's this belief, I call it the competency distrust from the older folks. There's this belief that young people aren't competent to run organizations or to lead. So for them, it's if you're older, that means you're a better manager or a better leader than the younger person, which I wouldn't even get into. But then there's also this talk. There's also this talk about experience is more important than.
But how will you get the experience?
But sometimes when you say experience, you have to now go into what they mean when they say experience, because not all experience is the same. What type of experience would the older folks have? Do you have relevant experience in leadership, in management, in administration? If you don't have that, and the younger people would have studied this, might have more experience than the older folks. But we don't see it because culturally, it's underpinned in the society, and that's what they believe. So when they get into power, they believe the young people have to go through this system where, we have to take you under our wings first, even though a younger person might be more experienced in a particular field than somebody who's older or have the experience.
Good that you went there, because Vishal, you made the point that a lot of the times, and of course when we say the political landscape, obviously everything is intertwined socially and all of that, as Clinton pointed out. But you also said, and of course I need your opinion on this as well, Mr. Erlin and Chevy, young people are used as tokens. And there was a big outcry the last election because both of the major political parties, they had the young people at the front of everything, and it was like a lot of young people are going to be involved and whatnot. And when it came down to it, it was quite the opposite. We were pushed to the back of the line, as you pointed out. We're just put as token, as trophies to attract other young people to get involved. And then when it comes to actual management, we're pushed to the side. And that was very evident during the last election on both sides.
Allow me to add something here, which will address and add to rather what Clinton said just a few moments before. As it relates to issues like crime on the rise in the Caribbean and the fact that most 80% of that crime, as Clinton would have quoted, is committed by youth under the age of 30. One of the problems that we face, and this of course deals with the interconnectivity of state apparatus, would be the fact that you are having, for example, in Guyana, we have the Youth Innovation Project of Guyana, we have the Youth Business Summit, and across the Caribbean, you have various UREP programs, which would be urban rural empowerment programs that seek to get young people more involved in business and help to empower them. However, the reality of the matter is, quite simply, young people, the average young person coming off the street, especially with the levels of illiteracy we have in Guyana and across the region, all right, don't have the capacity to go into their revenue authorities and register their businesses. Apart from the technical capacity, they don't have the finances to get those things done. So they can't get their compliance. That way, they're not getting the contracts that they ought to be getting, even though they might have had the technical capacity for their business, right, or the technical know-how for their business. And tying into your question now about youth tokenism and so on, I would have been observing a lot of what happened in the last election, and I speak from all aspects of the political spectrum rather. And what you found in many cases is that young people were used, yes, indeed, and pushed forward to say, look, we have young people as the face of our party, and we're going to bring a youthful vibe to this, and we're going to ensure that young people have their voices heard. But at the end of it all, when you get down to Central Committee meetings, they're saying, look, I've been waiting since the last election cycle to have my turn. So why do you think that you as somebody, as a young person, can come and take my place? And that ties right back into what Clinton was saying, that age in Guyana and in these general societies that we live in across the Caribbean, age is seen as rather an addendum to wisdom, right? And an addendum to competency.
Chevy, your thoughts on this, because I know you were on the ground, especially during that time, how young people are used as trophies to attract other young people to be involved in politics and to vote for a certain party and all of that.
The thing is, I believe that political parties use all of their supporters as pawns, basically. When you examine, especially, well, if you examine the way the political parties operate in Guyana, and you examine voting habits in Guyana, going back to the race issue, not deeply, but just to examine how Guyanese tend to vote. Typically speaking, the EPP is seen as a political party which is representative of Guyana's the Indians in Guyana, and the APNU/AFC is really seen as the representative party of the Afro-Guyanese. Now, in the last election, the youth vote was a significant thing, partially as a result of the Vote Like a Boss campaign that was implemented by the Guyana National Youth Council. Now, in this election, you had a very substantial population of Guyanese youth coming now to vote for the first time, even though some of them would have qualified to vote before. And so there was this large chunk of meat in front of the political parties and, just being dangled there. And so it was obvious that the youth vote was important. And the political party that would have won the elections, the political party that would have been able to attract the youth vote. And so either of the political parties would have done whatever they had to do in order to get that vote. The very way that they do whatever they have to do to get all of the other votes, the female vote, which is why we probably saw the PPP attempt to use a female prime ministerial candidate in the last elections before and what's now. The issue really is this when it comes to youth. And I'll just use this as an example. There was a member of the youth arm of the PNC in one of my classes a few years ago. And what he said, because we were talking about Guyana's political culture and how we tend to follow the line of the political party without questioning. And one of the things that he said is that if you wanted to get ahead, you have to don't dissent and you have to wait your turn, in essence. All right? And I don't think that this is anything that nobody knows, that nobody doesn't know, but everybody knows this, that in political party, the same it is in sometimes the police force and even the military, you have to wait your turn. Yes, you may be a young, educated person, a youth who has a degree or a master's, and you come into the party and you have ideas and you've demonstrated competence. But Comrade X or Mr. Y has been in the party for the last 20 years, and it is his turn. And because it is his turn, he will get his chance and you will wait and you will get your chance when your time comes around. So I completely agree with what my fellow panelists are saying. Youth are seen as token. We're dangled. They are dangled because I'm easing my way out of that bracket. But we're dangled in front of the political parties when we can be used to achieve a particular game. But when they have achieved that, they put persons who they believe. And I have to admit, they do believe that the persons that they put in these capacities are able to function better than young people because of the experience that they bring, because of the amount of time that they have been in those positions, which is not always the case, because time and time again we've seen young people come to the table and we've seen them come with competence, we've seen them come with ideas, we've seen them come with willingness to work, we've seen them come with knowledge, because quite often we see some of our political functionaries act and function and you have questions as to whether or not what you're seeing is reflective of the amount of time that they've been at the table. And so there's a question as to whether or not it isn't time for some of the young people who've actually been doing the work and who are actually knowledgeable to actually come to the table and we can get some things done.
Come next year, when we have the big electoral contest, that's the only time young people are seen as useful. When elections come, the politicians would use them. In fact, they create their own creatures within their own parties, or they create satellite groups to achieve such means. Guyana's problem there, from what I'm hearing, a lot of it is structural, and the structural is based on the foundation that I mentioned. We have these two big political giants that dominate the political landscape or the political structure. But true, the political is not the only way to demonstrate leadership. And I find in Guyana, everybody feels all the leaders come from just the political realm. There's a civil society. There's a civil society realm. Young people can form independent civil society groups and advocate on policy positions, which you don't see happening a lot because of, a lot of the fear and the backlash that would come with that. And also, the minute you start a civil society group that's independent, the first thing that happens is an attempt to label that as belonging to one of those two big political groups.
Vishal, you're smiling.
Yeah, and there's also, you can also, through civil society, you can pick a cause, you can pick a policy position, you could pick a sector, you could pick, even getting into business, the private sector. Those groups and those organizations have a voice. And young people also have the onus is on them to take personal responsibilities also to say, look, if I don't want to be part of the current political construct or the current political apparatus, we can get involved in starting our own advocacy organizations and policy-oriented groups that are independent, not the ones who will take directives from the political party. Because it's important that we have those independent voices to call things objectively when they see either policy positions going awry or there's a deficit where issues or certain areas are not being addressed by a certain segment of the population. And young people can get involved. But also politicians have a role even at the parliamentary level. If they want to create an environment that fosters input from young people in all sectors of society, is to make the parliament more interactive than it is currently. Because you just find those who are elected or selected, not elected, into the parliament. Those are the only ones that seem to have any sort of position, and then the whole entire population think those are the only important people in the society with the only voice, because we don't have a strong civil society. And the reason why we don't have a strong civil society, you can go back into our entire political history. I won't label it on any one government now or yesterday. Go all the way back. And it's strategic. You don't want a population to question. You don't want an educated population. There's an issue. I saw somebody talk about something there come across the screen about, try telling the young founders in Facebook and all these different, online startups that were started by 30-year-olds. At some point, I don't want to take up all the time, but I wanna see this. Part of Guyana's problem and this issue with young people not being involved generally across the society would not fix itself tomorrow. I would not blame the current government for the current what exists. I would not blame. Some blame could go to the previous government because it'll take about a generation or maybe 20 years for us to, because the countries, the non-oil and gas economy countries, the South Asian ones that have been successful, they've embarked what we call a knowledge-based economy. And we have to take a look at our education system and reform that whole system. We have a passive system. The kids go to school, they sit there. Whatever they're told, they go regurgitate, and that's what they say, I'm educated.
And you don't even have to work to pass to go to another grade. Exactly. That's another thing, too.
They're not forced to think creatively and analytically.
Clinton highlighted how youths can get involved, and it's not just politically involved. But how do we get a seat at the table politically? Because this seems like it's a fight for young people to get a seat at the table politically.
Well, I think there are two ways. One, you can join through one of the political parties. However, that has its advantages and disadvantages. You may find that you may be able to get an appointment to a particular government position, or you may get a prominent position in one of the political parties. However, if you are to advance, chances are you have to toe the party line. And political parties usually don't like people talking about the toeing of the party line, but you have to toe the party line. I recall a PNC, what was it? I can't remember the name of it, but where they have their elections and what's not. And I remember when Mr. Aubrey Norton would have vied for a particular position, and he was supported by Ada Lilly, and things were said. And Ada Lilly, as a member of the youth arm, was vilified for his support of somebody who was not the popular pick for the head of the political party of the PNC. So what you clearly see is that even as a youth, in order to be viewed in a favorable light by political parties, you have to toe the line. And if you were to toe the line, there is not much room for independent thinking. So if you are a individual who has your own ideas and you have a belief of what should or should not be done, that can be stifled in the party. So there's a question as to whether or not you're willing to keep your mouth shut long enough to get ahead and probably get a position and say something at that point, if that ever happens. And or you can do it from the outside. Mr. Erling mentioned civil society, and I think that that's one of the most effective ways to do so. But of course, there is the drawback, or not necessarily a drawback, but there's the negative implication of being labeled as a supporter of this party or a supporter of that party.
And also victimization.
Correct. So with respect to my first point, I think that some young people are the problem. Some young people really ought to accept some of the responsibility, because you choose to go into a party and quote unquote cover down, keep your mouth shut in order to get ahead in the political party, because you believe that this is what is necessary in order for you to get to the table, as you were talking about before, Tracy. So that is one avenue, but that avenue has its advantages in that you may achieve your goal, but at what cost? You can do it from outside of the fold in civil society, but that's much more difficult, because it's always more difficult working from outside. But on the outside, you have that freedom to think, you have that freedom to advocate, you have that freedom to determine your own agenda and even criticize. If you're to ask when was the last time you saw any member of the youth arm of the leading political parties criticize their political parties, I don't think I've ever seen the youth arm of the PNC or of the PPP criticized. I think I've seen the youth arm of the WPA criticize them from time to time, but I think that was once or twice. Now, on the outside even, I think that one of the issues that young people have in advocating is that many times we look at, okay, there's some organizations that are formed to address particular issues, and that is fine. But sometimes youth try to look at youth issues. So what are issues that we see as directly affecting youth? So education, poverty, but every single issue is a youth issue because every single issue affects us. The legal system, the criminal justice system, the parliament, the decision-making system, the whether or not our anti-corruption legislation is working well, our diplomatic relations, every single youth issues. Where I think one of the things that has to be done is we need to broaden our horizons and broaden our interests and some of the things that we focus on. So just to summarize, there are two ways that we can get to that table. One of the ways, both ways have advantages and disadvantages. I think what determines where you go is influenced by, in one sense, what your political socialization has been. So are you willing and ready to accept the political culture that has always existed in Guyana, political culture of party paramountcy, where you are not allowed to challenge a political party once you're part of that political party, really? Or are you willing to try to effect change from the outside? And that is a critical question.
Vishal, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll agree with all of what Chevy has said. I mean, there's not much more to be added there. What I will say, to add to the aspect of joining a political party. Now, I like to, or at least I'd like to believe, what I'd like to say that I walk the political midline. And I've encountered a few other young people who, would like to say the same as well. Now, you have two instances there. Some of those persons are usually, bought up, they're silenced after they've been bought up into these parties, essentially on the promise and the premise that, look, you can come here and you can share your ideas with us, and then they're pushed in a corner. But what's more dangerous in terms of joining a political party is that you can actually get into a party and be objective in some cases. I mean, we have Rickford Burke, for example, who's a member of the PNCR, very objective, and he actually tells people what it is. But what you find is that within those same political structures, you have different factions. And that ties right back into what Chevy was saying. If you don't follow what my faction says, especially if my faction is a popular faction, then you're just relegated to a side job per se, or a position that has no real relevance in the party, except to say at an election cycle that we as a political party can claim your face as one of the identities therein.
And of course, I know you have a lot to add, because for the last election, you were on the PPP's bill as one of the young people.
I'll just say this. One of the most important constituency I haven't heard, nor none of us have spoken of so far. And if there an attempt isn't made to change how we view, how they view the political landscape, I don't think much will happen. That's why I said this is a long-term process. You got to look at the populace. You got to look at the people. The people perpetuate and encourage and has been encouraging this two-party system. And young people feel as though, look, if I want to get into politics, I have to join one of these two groups. And for me, when I decided I wanted to make that leap into politics, that was the choice you were faced with, is either you join the two major political parties, hope the one that you join win, and then you can influence some policy from the inside. Or if you're brave enough and you think you have enough support, start your own political party. But I'll ask everybody listening to the program to go back in Guyana's history and show me where somebody has started. We had a few attempts, and a third party, somebody independent, unknown, who was not part of the political apparatus before. We had the AFC. Besides maybe Walter Rodney, I would say we've not had anyone who has been able to, and even with Walter Rodney, we didn't have the chance to see when he went to the polls what would have happened.
Yeah.
You start that independent third party as a young person and say, look, I don't want to join any, I'll start my own thing and I'll contest in the elections. You'll find it rather difficult to even raise funds. You'll find your family, your friends shunning you. And then when it comes on voting day, you might be lucky if you pick up any votes. I've even seen, if you look at the local government elections, I've seen some so-called popular people that you thought, hey, these guys are definitely they'll probably even become mayor in some of these constituencies and stuff. And it never materialized because a lot of it is the people. One of the reasons is we need to ensure that there's civic education. And that's why I say it has to come, it's a long-term program. Civic, and also we need to change the way we teach people generally. They have to start thinking critically and analytically and stop saying, hey, I belong to a tribe, so I'll stick with my tribe. I don't care what my tribe does better than the other tribe.
Yeah, but you said that, it's going to be difficult if you were to start your own party and all of that, and you're going to get shunned. But even if you joined, because I know you had a lot of criticism, you joined one of the major political parties and you were bashed and you were supported as well.
Which is okay. You know, I tell people
so
if you get
either way, you know,
but
even
for
if
me,
you do
but
start
for
one
me,
or you join one.
For me, it should not be whether you get if you get into politics, expect that.
Definitely.
I see people. Everybody's so soft these days. They get into something and they listen because social media and everybody believes social media is real life. So somebody has an opinion of you or say something of you, social media, people take it on and all sorts of stuff. If you want to get into politics, the reality is those things are going to come to you. If you love your country and you're talking that you want to effect change in some way, you have to look at practicable ways that you can get involved. And you have to expect and anticipate the political lashback or pushback that will come with it. It's part of the game. Whether you join a party and say, look, I want to maybe effect change from using this party's apparatus, or you start your own thing, expect that to happen to you as a young person or anybody getting. I see a lot of people come to me, Clinton, when you're starting something, let's do something. And most times I'm deterred or I'm skeptical because I'll say, I know when push comes to shove and we say, hey, let's go public. Lots of people shy away because they can't take the barrage and what will come from them. And so anybody who's saying, oh, the backlash, expect the backlash. If you think you can garner or votes and change people's perspectives on political parties in Guyana and take away votes from those two giant parties, I would say go for it, take the backlash and go for it because you will effect change. But it's hard because of the cultural and sociological underpinnings of the society and the political arena in Guyana. From ever. And this go all the way back to pre-independence. And that's why when I see people talk about the Facebooks and so forth, those economies, you look at Singapore, somebody mentioned Singapore and the South, Japan and all these guys. Those governments made decisions to say, look, we're going to reform our education system. We're going to produce value-added products, which create employments because they create large factories. Guyana, we kept our system. We came out of colonialism. We kept the system because we liked the system. We wanted to ensure that the people were always subjugated to the political masters. You don't want to change it, so they wanted full control. We kept it. It's in our benefit to not educate the majority of the populace or to get anybody stepping out of the zone and criticizing anything. And that's why we were here today. But if we start today to say, look, we want to create a different cadre of people coming up in the future, and even currently change some of the mind frame. Let's start with the education system. Let's start looking at creative thinking. Let's start looking at analytical thinking. I tell people you have to think for yourself. There's no one model or one way to do anything. Yeah. And you have to question everything. Why should I just, I joined, you spoke about me joining one party. I joined a party, but everybody believed because I joined that party. All my views were singularly and still to this day aligned to whatever that party says. Likewise, if I criticize the current government, they'll say, oh, because you only criticize because I can't think independently and objectively. And that's part of how we think. That's our psyche. If Clinton or I come tomorrow and I've done this. I've praised things I've seen in the current government. In fact, for me, when the PPP lost, I was hopeful that these guys survive and these guys do a great job because when they succeed, I succeed as a businessman. I have interest here in Guyana. And I grew up there. That's my country that I love. So I want to see any government in power to succeed. But in Guyana, people label you. And people believe you can't hold these objective views, which is sad, but it's part of our cultural upbringing. Regardless of what I say here today, somebody wrote me, I'll listen to the program, but I hope you're not biased. Why can't I be objective? Because I joined with the PPP then. I could today say, look, I like the policies of what the current government is doing, but I'll tell you, I don't like everything because lots of things that they've done I don't like, and some I do. But for Guyana to change, we need major transformation.
Definitely. We're going to go online. We have an online question, and then I want for us to touch a little bit on the small parties. So the online question is from Mr. Saisnarayan Singh. Good afternoon. What does the panelists feel about a 50-50 strategy, 50% of all the slate being from a person below the age of 50 years of age? Vishal, your thoughts on that? Do you want for me to repeat the question?
No. Actually, I have been saying for quite some time, and even my organization, Move On Guyana, we have been advocating for Parliament and all political parties to have their list of representatives be 33%, at least rather 33% women, and at least 50% of their total representation youth. Of course, we do not tie into a definition of youth, but most would work with the 15 to 35 that the UN uses. And we'll extend it here for Mr. Singh's question to 50%. Now, yes, we need to ensure that there's involvement of the 50-50 strategy, because of course you're going to have the wisdom of the older persons, and of course you're going to have the vibrancy and new ideas of youth. And I think that this goes throughout. Now, whilst political parties and especially political commentators might be listening, might not necessarily agree with this, I'll say let's look at starting from the very basics. Let's look at state boards. Let's look at the boards of ministries. Let's look at ensuring that young people are included from the very basic, and then of course you can build on that going forward. Of course, this does not tie into saying that young people are entitled to anything just because they're youth. You have to prepare yourself, and I've said this before. Young people, yes, we say that we're not the future, we're today, and that the Constitution and preamble of the Constitution rather says that Guyana belongs to us and is for us. But then again, we must also prepare ourselves to be for Guyana. I can't sit at home and expect that things are just going to come to me and be handed to me if I don't get out there and educate myself, whether it's technically and vocationally or in using formal education avenues. And at the end of it, there are two faces rather to that coin, or two sides to that coin, where we expect that it must happen, but then again we must prepare and understand what our roles and responsibilities are.
Chevy?
I'm not sure that I can say that I'm in agreement of a particular percentage, because when you get down to the mechanics of determining exactly how you select the persons to fill that particular quota, it can be very complicated. However, what I am in support of is the political parties, when working through their internal mechanisms and ascertaining that they're young individuals in the political parties who are capable of functioning, that you give those persons a chance. There are some young persons in political parties who are more qualified for some of the positions that all the members of the political parties hold. And if you find that this is the case, then you give those persons a chance and not allow the amount of years that you've been with a political party to determine whether or not you are chosen for a seat. It goes back to what Clinton Erlin mentioned before, the culture of political parties and the culture generally of Guyana, in that age and not necessarily experience, but more so membership, I guess I should say, determines whether or not you get a chance, or years of membership determines whether or not you get a chance. So I wouldn't say, and I think it's very difficult to pin representation down to a 50% or to say 50% or 30% or 20%. That can be very difficult. And I guess positive discrimination always comes with its issues, but I say be reasonable in all circumstances, because it's quite obvious that young people are capable of functioning once they're given a chance, so long as young people step up to the plate and demonstrate that they're capable of doing so. I was a student at the University of Guyana for 7 years, and one of the things that you saw at UG sometimes is that when students were called in many cases to do things that were of interest to them, and I was one of those students, sometimes you just don't turn up, protests, etc. So there's protests for a decrease in fees because the vice chancellor is increasing fees by $5,000 and $10,000, and the UGSS calls for a protest, and you have a paltry population of the university campus turning out. Now, even though in Guyana you have a culture of victimization when persons protest, I'm not sure that your lecturer is going to be looking for you in a group of persons to determine, oh yeah, I'm going to punish that student because that student is protesting. And as a matter of fact, the protest is never about the lecture, it's really about administration. And of course, you may know of the dynamics between the administration and the lecturer, so it's not really an issue. So when you look at that as an example, that's just one example. That is an indication of how some young people operate and how seriously they take their civic duty to something that is directly of interest to them. I think one of the problem comes with making linkages and how linkages affects interest. In many cases, we're not able to generate sufficient interest to participate in a meaningful way because we have not made a linkage between the issue and how that issue affects us. Many times when we can't make that linkage, then we act. There have been many protests in Guyana over the years, but all of the protests which really are the substantial ones, or you see massive participation on the part of people are protests where people have been able to make that linkage. So for example, when we had the issue of the parking meter, that would have touched almost everybody's pocket who drove or who had a relative who used to drive. So people turned out in droves and they were able to effect that change. So when we're talking about competence, one of the things that we have to look for, Clinton mentioned this, is critical thinkers who are able to make the connection, who are the young people who are willing to make the sacrifices, who are the young people who are working and working competently. And when we identify those persons, do not put those persons on the back burner in favor of a person who has been with the political party for a longer amount of years. Because at the end of the day, those persons will not function as well as they ought to, and your political party is going to take flack for that. But again, going back to political culture, because in this conversation, we cannot stop talking about political culture and political socialization. Because even though I find that both young and older persons are a bit more open in their thinking and in their willingness to not vote or switch to political party that they're voting for, by and large, at the end of the day, after we criticize the political party for 5 years, when elections come around,
you go back to tribes.
Yeah, but I know Clinton has quite a bit to add as well.
Really
but
quickly.
we have Mr. Rajendra Bisesar. He says the unfortunate thing is that political leaders of today do not like and so do not promote independent thinkers. They promote yes men, and that is something that you alluded to.
Most definitely. They don't. Nobody wants to see a challenge to the status quo politically, especially for those who are already politicians or senior seasoned. And in fact, because this is a career choice for them. For somebody like me, Clinton Erling, I'll say, look, I'll dabble in a little bit of politics. It doesn't work out. I got entrepreneurial pursuits, or I might go back to say, let's do something with civil society or pick up a cause. In terms of the question before with from Cessna saying, I agree with Chevy here. I am not a big fan of quota. Even though when you have unrepresented minorities, it might be a great idea. I'm a fan of competency. I've had experience, being a business person. I've also led the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce, a senior executive private sector commission, and also the Guyana Football Federation. I was the president there. When I made decisions, it had nothing to do with age. When we looked to hire in all these different positions, the consideration was competency first and foremost. And whether the person was 80 years old or the person was 19 years old, the consideration for us was, look, can this person get the job done? Does this person have the relevant experience to execute and implement? Do they have the educational background to suit a particular role? I think for us as politicians, politics, we've come to equate a lot of politics to people who are... We like lawyers too. In Guyana, there's this attorney culture. Everybody likes attorneys, and they think attorneys are the most brilliant people.
Chevy would agree.
But for successful political escapades or experience, I think we need a lot of administrators and people who understand finance and understands how the economy works, not just domestic in Guyana, but also how the global economy works, and how could we attract investments back home. How do we talk about the employment issue. It's the big issue. 40% of people unemployed. I think the number is larger, by the way. I put out an ad tomorrow in the newspapers to hire somebody in my restaurant. You should see the response. It's ridiculous. I think that number is very conservative. But at the end of the day, we need administrators. We have lots of these politicians that would not even understand, besides maybe the finance minister when he releases the budget, what some of those terminology means, what the numbers mean, what's the implications of those numbers, how the economy function, how do we create these jobs. And I think if we don't start to look at, okay, who are competent people getting into politics? Who are the competent people I'm going to pick on my slate? And a wide diverse, and it can come from everywhere, young people. And that's why I don't understand why you see with the current political land, this, I say, foolishness about, you have to be old or you have to have age to be successful, because somebody might be my age and have more experience in working with groups, working with teams, leading organizations than somebody who's 60. Or you might have Chevy's coming out. Chevy said, look, he's going to come back to Guyana when he finished at the University of the West Indies, a young lawyer. He's coming back to draft policy. And for me, when he said that, that's the first person I've heard who've gone on to law school said something like that. And I was impressed because I started an organization back in Guyana called Blue Caps, and the primary function and purpose of it was for advocacy and policy implementation. Reason why I did it, there was a deficit within
and what
the
is happening
society
with
for
Blue
it.
Caps, now that you've mentioned that?
You see, Blue Caps became a microcosm of the larger society. Everybody saw Clinton Orling, it was a Clinton Orling group. But if you looked at the membership of Blue Caps, in fact, right now, Blue Caps have members who are senior party supporters of the current government, and some are opposition party supporters. The organization was never meant to be about one person, but everybody made it out. The media framed it as a one person, and then when I left, you had these other young people who took up the mantle. But since 2015, I've noticed there's a vacuum in terms of civil society, young people organizations, especially when it comes to policy. And I've seen a political group just came up, or a civil society young people group came up. You take a look at their chart. That's why what Chevy is saying is important. Lots of these folks, because of their background, don't know how to draft policy, don't know how to do the relevant research. Sometimes they don't get the input from the relevant folks. So for them to come up with positions that would be taken seriously is a hard thing. Part of the problem, too, also comes from the media. The media frames the pictures in people's minds every day. If the media makes something the headline tomorrow, that's the story everybody's going to be talking about. If Chevy starts or Vishal starts his political party tomorrow, if Starbrook News decides, look, I'm going to run behind this group and give them the coverage every day, or Kaichur News every day, you better believe that the populace would start to listen to that party, to that group. But when these things happen, you'll find even the Demoara waves or the online ones, they give them no coverage. The kids come out, they have a policy position, they have a voice, but then they get no coverage. If you don't get coverage, the people don't take you serious. Here in the United States, when the young people come out, you see Obama a couple of years ago challenging the establishment, the big mighty, Bill Clinton establishment and Hillary. He only succeeded because the media came behind him and gave him that kind of platform. Here in Guyana, it doesn't happen. They look at if Vishal is part of a group now, I think I saw.
Move on, Guyana.
I haven't seen much from them in the media, but if they put something out, maybe if it's not one or two sympathetic media house might put something in there, but it's never the headline story. The headline story tomorrow is going to be what happened at the AFC Congress or what happened at the PNC Congress or the PPP Congress.
Interesting that you would say that, indeed, that of course the media has a role to play in not just politically, but in every aspect of our lives. I also want to touch on the rise of new political parties. We have quite a few political parties who are establishing themselves, and I know you touched on it too, but I'd like for Vishal to go first to talk about Clinton also said that it's going to be quite a challenge, and already some of them, one businessman, he withdrew from one of the political parties that he was funding because he said he was already being victimized and challenged, and he was afraid that something could happen to his business. Your thoughts on that, and where do we go from here?
Right. So as Clinton said, there are many challenges to establishing a political party. It's not just about getting a group of people together and saying, hey, we have a symbol, we have a color, we have an ideology, and probably a manifesto, and we'll run with it. There's money involved, there's logistics. You got to think about, as we mentioned just prior, media coverage, because of course, if you don't have certain strategic alliances, you're not going to get your message over to the people. Then there's the other aspect of who you include in your party, and I say this not to come off from a irrational perspective, but rather you can include different persons in your party, and everybody comes with their own ideas, and more than likely persons coming to your party with money want their way, some way or the other. That's the culture we've had, right? There are few and far in between who would commit to a cause and say, look, I'm going to give you resources, and I'm going to look at how you play out with these resources, and I'm not going to try to influence it for my own gain. It's basic human nature, right? We make an investment, we want to see a return on our investment. But at the end of all of that, you still have to mesh all those factors with the factors, or rather the views of the people that you're trying to represent. All right. And of course, those other activists that you're going to try to buy over and pull over to your cause. And you know, a lot of parties come out with a lot of ideals and a lot of ideas, but there are two major questions that I like to ask people when they come to me and say, look, we've got an idea for this or I've got an idea for that. How much is it going to cost and who is it going to affect, right? And if you're able to answer those two questions, then I'm going to ask you where you're going to find your resources from, and are those resources ethical, right? Of course, we look at monitoring and evaluation in policy and advocacy, and we talk about how we want to represent the interests of one, but do we then do that at the expense of another? And that's the conundrum that many parties have found themselves in. Case in point, for example, we've had the LJP just being formed, and right away they were labeled as the quote-unquote Armenian party, quite simply because of the ethnicity of their founding leader. And coming out of that, you also have the elements that we spoke of as it relates to education and political tribalism. I've had people say to me, look, I know that, yeah, these guys probably not doing the things that they should have been doing. However, I'm going to vote, you know, for them quite simply because mama, aja, chachi, brother, sister, husband, wife, somebody said that I need to vote for them, or quite simply because the population and the individuals in our population are not empowered to say, look, if I make a political choice to advocate for and vote for a different political party than, you know, has been the status quo in my home, in my family, in my village, right, or my township, then, you know, and if I make that choice rather than I'm put out of the house, if I am disenfranchised by my family, if I'm disowned by my parents, I can then move on and actually make a living for myself. We don't have those mechanisms. We don't have the proper social support mechanisms for, let's say, for example, I go vote for party X, but my family, you know, was voting for party Y, and then I find myself on the road the next day to go make life per se. Right, you know, we tie back into hiring based on competence, but then, you know, you're looking for experience, but how are you going to get the experience to, first of all, be competent? And then there's the other aspect as well, where you have persons who are graduating, right, but then they're not, you know, like Clinton said, some of the applications are horrible. You have persons graduating with degrees, but they're not functionally competent. You know, you put them into a setting and they can't give you what their degree and all those credits they would have acquired.
And we've had a lot of cases of those on both sides, both government, where, you know, the government or the parties, they're looking bad because they would have hired a party faithful and they can't perform, they can't function in the capacity. And still, you know, these are things that the society is agitated about, would speak out, and still there's no regard for our opinions in many cases, because this person came up with us from the trenches and they've helped the party and they would do certain things that someone else would not do for the party. So you have to have all of those people involved, and they really and truly cannot function.
Yeah, Mary been with us 40 years, so we got to give her a position.
Mary has to get something.
That's why I say the age don't matter.
You know, one of the things I've also seen as an unfortunate incident is that if you come from families with diverse political backgrounds, let's say, for example, I'll speak very colloquially here, if you're a Douglas man, for example, and we look at the two mainstream political parties, and yes, I am speaking from experience, what you find is that one side of your family, you know, tends to shun you for the other side, and then you're being told, oh no, you shouldn't advocate for this political cause, or you shouldn't criticize this party because I might lose my job, or, you know, something might happen to your uncle, and that sort of thing. So you also have the fear, the general fear, and sorry to be droning on and on, but you have the general fear where people believe in your political cause, but they're afraid to come and join you and your political party and help to push you, quite simply because you cannot at this point guarantee them job security, and they're afraid of losing their job quite simply because of the political nature at this point in time.
I'll let Clinton add to that, but I personally, this new party that was formed, I know a lot of people were laughing, fed up. They said, you know, they have a lot of powerful businessmen behind them, and that's how they're getting their funding, and large contractors and all of that, but none of them will come forward because of fear of victimization. Clinton.
And they're even lucky. They're even lucky that they get in funding, because you come in independently, the business people, and I'm part of the private sector in Guyana, so I know and I've also been on the civil society side. You go to them and you say, look, we got a policy position we want to advance. It's very difficult to get the business people on board. Vishal spoke about return on investment is a seminal for private sector folks, and they'll look at that. Why invest in you? And we have the two big main parties. Those are the ones we know
advance
we can, our interest and maybe our return on our investment for them.
Chevy, your thoughts?
Okay, so I want to touch on the question that you had asked initially about political parties wanting yes men. I think the simple thing to say about that is our electoral system and our certain aspects of our constitution facilitates what has become a political party culture of saying yes and basically covering down. So our constitution requires, if a person is not desirous of supporting the party list, to indicate that to the speaker before he or she takes a decision which is not in support of the list. And when that person does that, the political party can get rid of that person. So in essence, what that is engineered to do is to ensure that everyone in a political party, once in parliament, for example, and there's a vote, persons vote along party lines. Now, we had an anomaly last December when a member of the coalition government voted for the PPP. I'm not sure if that was ever done in the history of our parliament, but those particular provisions in our constitution were specifically engineered to ensure things like that did not happen. So as to the question of whether or not political parties want yes men, I think the constitution answers that question clearly, yes. And it's also seen in the workings of the political parties, but we won't get into that. And the question of the likelihood of political parties succeeding, again, we have to go back to socialization, whether or not third parties will succeed. We have the PPP, we had the PNC, which is now part of the larger coalition, even though the coalition government is seen still largely as the political party of Afro-Guyanese. The AFC was able to make some amount of ground. However, the AFC was comprised of persons who were popular because of their associations and membership with either the PNC or the PPP. So whether or not we're able to have this third force is a really difficult question to answer. A third force of persons who are completely unattached and unaffiliated with the established political parties. It's a bit different. It's a bit difficult to do that. In my opinion, some of the most competent persons that I know who can function in government have no interest in joining either the political parties, largely because it would be very difficult for them to cover down and to toe the party line, especially when they disagree. I always tell persons, when the PPP does good things, praise it. When it does bad things, criticize it. When the coalition government does good things, praise it. When it does bad things, criticize it. In some families, it is a sin. You can be, and I'm going to use this word loosely, excommunicated from your family for criticizing the family's political party. So there are a host of things that need to be dealt with in terms of our political culture and in terms of our political socialization before any third force or fourth force has any chance of gaining substantial ground. And even before young people are able to get a chance, because as we're looking at this, the young people's view or youth view of the political landscape, many of our parents don't necessarily believe that we're competent enough to function, not necessarily parents, but older folks in society do not necessarily believe that you are competent to perform in particular capacities, unless, again, it's a belief, so it's not logical, it's not rational, it's based on a belief. So unless and until they see you functioning and see you function effectively, they will not believe. And of course, they cannot see you functioning and function effectively until you're given that post. So it's a catch-22. And on the last point that you mentioned, I had written it down here, so I'm looking at it. In terms of the financing of political parties, what Clinton and Vishal spoke about, I don't think that that's something that you can get away from. The funding and the wanting to get a return from what has been paid to political parties. You see that in the US, you see that in Latin American countries, you see that in Europe. You can't get away from that. The important thing with that, I think, is to ensure that policies, when made, are not irrational, are not hurtful, only because the political parties are trying to pay back this debt that they would have incurred by receiving finance. So we really need to, and that's why I absolutely love what Clinton said earlier about civic education. In order to change all of what we're discussing, and in order to really give young people a chance, we need to have civic education over a period of years to change the thinking of young people, to change the thinking of older folks, and hopefully we'll see some amount of change.
And something that can help
So
it,
I've
what Chevy mentioned.
Yeah, Clinton, go ahead. And Vishal, right after you come in.
Yeah, and something that Chevy mentioned, and also just ironically, the federal parties promoting. We got to look at Guyana's political situation from the macro structural level. This proportional representation list system has to go if you want to talk about independent thinkers. If we have a force past the post-constituency system, where different constituencies elect people who directly represents them in the National Assembly, we will definitely see a change in the way in both the populace think and also their representatives when they get to Parliament. Nobody's thinking about the party line exclusively. They're thinking more, okay, does this particular policy or initiative benefit my constituency back home? And this is, I left university many years ago. And I wrote my thesis on changing Guyana's the political structure and system. And today it's still there because, again, there's no meaningful political will from the current crop of politicians, from the main parties who've dominated the scene, to change the system.
Vishal, you were adding.
Yeah, so to add to what Chevy would have been saying about, and Clinton as well, about civic engagement, in 2013, running into the later parts of 2014, there was a Leadership and Democracy Project, better known as the LEAD Project, and earlier this year, Dennis Glasgow, Ethan Corbett, and I would have founded the Policy Desk, which was a civil society organization aimed at bringing civic engagement right down to the community level. What you find therein is that whilst we want to advocate for these things, we also must teach them in the school systems, because in many cases we found that persons looked at us, and I'm speaking here of the Policy Desk, persons looked at us and said, hey, what are you coming to our community for? Are you trying, and I'm speaking of adults here, yeah? Are you trying to, change how we teach our young people? Are you trying to tell them that we've been wrong for all this time? So yes, I actually do agree with both of you, and this needs to come right back into our teachings in high school, and even from the primary level, where we teach about systems of government, and then we get them to critical thinking in the high school situation. And of course, going back to education, I'll jump back a little to, I think, a young man named Leroy and my friend Josh Kanai would have mentioned. What we need here in Guyana is a total sociocultural reform. We need to look at changing what we accept as our cultural norms, having Guyanese have something as a culture that they can accept and own for themselves. And quite frankly, I believe that everything that we have as Guyanese culture, we have borrowed from somewhere, right? All the elements of our festivities, all the elements of, well, not all, but most elements of national identity, like our dishes and so on, we've adopted from other places. So we need a cohesive and collective drive from the public institutions like government and all these institutions, as well as private individuals and organizations. I'd love to see a rebirth of Blue Caps, for example. Great work, Clinton. To ensure that you teach the next generation, because what we find as well is that a lot of these organizations and individuals get burnout, and it's either a burnout of technical capacity or a burnout of other resources, related to financing, for example. And at this point, I'd just like to issue a call to all of us to, as we say, move on, get up and move on from the political rhetoric that we've had for the past 50 odd years, and just see the change that you want to see. Be like the young people like Trisha Tika, Darwin Wills, and all the others who are getting up and making their small change and ensuring that they put out there what they want to see.
And I know everyone is alluding quite a bit to education and all of that, and then to do it through the system, through the formal educational system. But then you also said that, political leaders usually, for their interests, would prefer an ignorant population. So how are we going to get there? What do we do?
If you go the route to the education system, that's a long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight. People aren't going to get up tomorrow and say, look, our opinions of our socio-cultural opinions and historical opinions will just evaporate overnight because John said in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years that it should change. That's a long-term project. Still, I'm optimistic that things could be done. You're asking the question, how could we penetrate this? And it has to come. I think one of the seminal role has to come from the media. The media in Guyana has the singular most important role to play. When I remember when Camarade Ramjitan and Raphael Trotman left their respective parties, and they said, look, and Sheila Holder, and they said, look, let's form this AFC. I'm very involved in terms of reading the news and ensuring that I'm informed. Starbrook News almost daily would follow and give coverage to both these individuals and the pursuit of when the AFC was birthed. In fact, both of those individuals had their own columns in Starbrook News. So the media has that role to play in terms of building leaders in not just in politics though, but it should be in business, it should be in arts, it should be in culture. You identify up and coming young individuals engaged in civic activism and say, look, let me promote them and put them out front. Let them be in the headlines. What is Chevy's position? What is Vishal's position today? What is the leader of the Georgetown Chamber? What's their position today? And make those headlines. Also, we need 1 or 2 role models to step out. We need leaders from the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce is one of those organizations where I see lots of young people on the board. Also, you look at, there's this organization called CESAD. They advocate for gay rights and so forth. And we've been doing it for a number of years. Yeah. And the leadership that they've shown, they've made significant inroads into changing and effecting on that issue. So a lot of it we have to have role models within civil society organizations who the media also cover. And they must also be brave and bold enough to advocate on their convictions and inspire other people. I could tell you guys the story when I joined the Chamber of Commerce, what it was before the Old Boys Club and what it is today. It's a whole different game. Likewise with SASOD, nobody talked about issues of cross-dressing and gay rights and all that stuff. Now it's accepted. Now we have parades and everything, and because of the leadership shown by that organization and the individuals at the helm of that organization. And you just imagine if the media compounds the coverage that they're doing currently for those organizations and those individuals leading those organizations, the impact.
Vishal? Go ahead, Chevy.
I think, as Quentin was alluding to, that the approach has to be multifaceted. It can't be one avenue or 2 or 3. It has to be a holistic approach. Civic education through the school system is essential, absolutely essential. For example, the United States of America has one of the highest participatory rates among their young people. And it's because of the fact the United States has implemented in its school system from as low as middle school, as low as middle school, civic education system. So they know systems of government, they know branches of government, and they know the relationship between the people and the government and what their role is and how they can tap in to that political system. And they're also told that their input is valuable to the political system functioning, which is why we see college students, university students, who are some of the primary drivers of change in the US, and even you find it happening in Africa in some cases and European countries. So civic education through the school system is absolutely essential. Now, the media is a bit tricky, partially because at the end of the day, even though the media has a role, it's in it to sell papers in many cases. And the question is, what are people interested in reading? What do people want to read? And that is why in many cases, you're not going to find Vishal Joseph starts new organization in the front page. You're going to see man kills woman and then kills self. Or this political party leader says this about the other political party, because people culturally, we are drawn to what's happening in terms of crime, and we're drawn in terms of what's happening in terms of the political
You'd be surprised
landscape.
how much the media editors can frame that.
I take your point, but at the end of the day, they're businesses, and these will be some of the considerations. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I agree with you. I'm just saying that these are some of the considerations. Now, with respect to the importance, you had mentioned, Erling, the importance of changing our electoral system, and as I indicated, that's very important as well, because Tracy, when you're in your seat and vote is being taken on a particular decision, you're not thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to be beneficial to my constituency? Do you even know who you can? Do you even have a constituency?
You don't care. You don't have to.
Who are you accountable to? And if democracy facilitates accountability, especially our system, then our members of parliament, who based on our constitution are the representatives of the people, the constitution clearly says that people are sovereign and they exercise their sovereignty through their representatives. However, their representatives are not accountable to the people. They are accountable to the list. Therefore, in order to maintain your position in the parliament, you have to vote in accordance with the list. So in order to ensure that our members of parliament know that if they make a decision that this district or that district does not agree with, they're going to be removed, as is the case in some of the other electoral systems that we have around the world, we need to change that particular system. Civic society, I think, needs to continue doing work which is being done by Vishal and even the Guyana Youth Council in talking to young people and trying to change their perspective. I remember a time in a class where I asked a group of students to consider, we were talking about branches of the government and we were talking about the executive, and there's this great fear of the executive branch of Guyana. Ministers, these mystical, mysterious people who move around in these big fancy vehicles with bodyguards, and we're all afraid of them. But then I asked my class to consider this. They are your employees. You employ them. The president of Guyana, the most powerful man in Guyana, arguably, is your employee, and every 5 years you assess his performance and on objective criteria determine whether or not he gets to keep that job. Think about that for a minute. And some of my students, their minds were blown because they had never perceived that role in that way before.
But Chevy,
so something as simple.
You're talking to university students, and their minds are blown at that simple concept. Imagine the populace.
I understand that, but this is just an example, because these are, for example, students who came from high school, who did social studies with branches of government, and you're shown that they're co-equal branches of government and all of these things, but they never consider that they had power over the executive branch of government. Now, of course, it's not that simple.
No. I agree with you, but I'm saying just imagine they're university students. Yeah. Imagine the general non-university level populace.
And their mindset and understanding.
If the university people can be blown by that, tell me, man.
So there needs to be a concerted effort by all stakeholders. And what the point that Clinton raises is a brilliant point. Do policymakers, do members of government want an informed people who will question them at every turn, who will hold them accountable at every turn, who will ask questions from an informed place, who know what the questions that need to be asked are?
So therefore, are they going to make the changes needed in the education system? And I know you made the point that it's a long-term situation. And can we depend on our leaders to do that?
It has not happened.
Vishal, I'm going to bring you in. Vishal, you add, and then we're going to go back to Clinton. Do they want that? Can we depend on our leaders to reform the educational system so that our people, our children, are going to be more educated and knowledgeable and can make better informed decisions?
Right. So I don't think that we can sit back and wait for our leaders to do so, because, of course, like Chevy and Clinton would have reiterated or rather stated, it benefits them, right? Having a huge subset of the population that you can radicalize and sensationalize every 5 years is beneficial to staying in power and ensuring that, and I'm not throwing any hints at anyone here, the money flows. But at the end of it all, it comes back to the home setting as well, because families have, a responsibility onto themselves. Your friends have a responsibility onto you, and you have a responsibility onto yourself as well to go out there and seek the information. It's not that the information is not there, right? Educational reform will come from within when, one, we pay our teachers enough to care, or as was the case, maybe 20 years ago, where you had parents actually being actively involved in the schooling of their children by providing schools, classrooms, and teachers with resources that made them actually, care about teaching the children. That's one. Number two, I think that with the advent of modern technology, we have so many things to distract us, and we've been promoting some of the things that might not necessarily advance our cause as a people. And I think that at the end of it all, we need to teach our children to read more, and that love of education will make them demand more. You go into certain schools and you have teachers being questioned by students. You have certain topics being challenged and so on, and you have student movements that come up with their own ideas, that do research and so on. But that has been lacking here because we don't have resources. So educational reform has many different aspects to it. It has to do with the approach that we take to it, what our priorities are. Are we going to look to creating an economy that is services based? Are we looking to create an economy that looks more towards manufacturing? Are we mixing the two? And going back a little bit as well, do the people want to accept the education? That's the other thing. So it ties into our culture. And every little issue that we look at, as Chevy mentioned, there are youth issues, but then there are all issues that affect youth, right? And affect everyone. So all these things interplay, and we have to look at it from a concerted and collective approach. We can't try to tackle one aspect and think that it's going to work overnight. Like Clinton said, it's not going to happen next year or the year after. And it also has a lot to do with what leaders, and when I say leaders, I mean civil society leaders, and as Clinton mentioned, role models get out there and do. You can advocate for the change that you want to see, and if you step into a school setting and provide them with the resources that are necessary. Of course, you do your basic SWOT analysis, you do vulnerability and capacity and that sort of thing. I think that in the end, the system is going to force leaders themselves to make the changes that the system has already been enacting. So I don't say that, I don't agree rather that we should sit back and just depend on and just make recommendations for the Minister of Education or anyone, whether it's regardless of which administration they're from, to make that change that we want to see. Because if it's not their vision, they're not going to do it. And that's just the nature of politics.
True.
Look, we should all play our part. As citizens of Guyana, we have that responsibility to play our part. But I'll say this, unfortunately, for any seismic or major change to occur, it will require political will and political leadership. It has to come from the top. I always say, if you show me a poor or bad organization in any sector, private, public, anywhere, I always say, show me the leader, show me his or her management style, and that's the reflection of the organization you'll see. If there's no political will coming from the top, if Guyana does not for some reason gets lucky and we have a leader who wants or understands that we don't have a choice, leaders don't have a choice. We're entering a new age in Guyana. We have an oil and gas economy coming. In fact, I just read a study the IMF commissioned. And the study from the IMF is saying, look, lots of these jobs that are going to come on stream will require skilled labor. We talk about unemployment being high, and we want to hire people in that industry. They will have to equip themselves with the necessary skills. It comes back to the education system, changing that. We talk about, you look at examples again in Singapore, the non-oil and gas sectors in the economy now. Again, even those, to transform those, we also need a different approach to the education system. One that's more analytical and creative and encourages innovation, and also teaches entrepreneurship as a viable option as opposed to traditional employment levels. All of this will have to come from the leadership, understanding that, look, this is a multi-dimensional, multifaceted economy we're dealing with. And when I say economy, I want to include every sector, including the political sector here. One cannot survive without the other. Maybe the political can survive without the others, to the detriment of the country being successful, or the country's success. And until that leader understands that, look, this reform is necessary. The Singapores, the Japans, what they did is to educate the population. They didn't have oil and gas, but they said, look, we want to do value added. We want to create factories to create cars, which can create thousands of jobs. First, we had to educate the people on how to produce cars, the mechanics behind that, the education behind that. And then that led from cars to ICT to technology. These guys were building laptops, computers, and all the new technology that we saw. And those things commanded higher prices on the world market. And that's how your GDP go up faster than the primary. You see, we depended on sugar, bauxite, and all these things. That's all we thought about. And today now there's this say we going down the same road where everybody's looking at oil and gas. I see everybody trying to get in there because that's the only thing we know, as opposed to saying, hey, let's change the system. In 20 years, that's when in 20, in about 10 or 15, the majority the income from the oil and gas will start to mature. Don't worry 2020 in the first couple of years. When we got to pay back the oil companies first. And then we'll start to see, so the next generation will be a critical generation. Let's start with these guys now in terms of changing the system. I love CARICOM. Again, when I did my master's, I criticized the whole movement. But we have to break away from that system, that education system, and chart our own course. Guyana is going into uncharted waters, and if we want to develop, this thing has to be looked at holistically. I hate discussions when you talk about politicians and this person and doing this and this person. The only person that can affect it tomorrow, though, if he or she wants to change it, is the president, the leadership in the country. If he or she gets up tomorrow and decides that, look, I want to pursue a path that's going to take this country in the future, and it has to start with a plan coming from him or her. A holistic plan to say, this is how I'll transform the economy in the next 30 to 40 years. And this is what we're going to do.
All right. So we have an online question that we're going to go to. And this is from Mr. Rajendra Bisesar. What should the youths do to ensure the oil patrimony is preserved for them? Chevy, you can go. Or Clinton, you want to go?
I touched on it briefly just now. Yeah. So that's basically, that's my point. So Chevy, go ahead.
Chevy, is your mic on mute? Because we're not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm sorry about that. One of the things that we need to do is place ourselves strategically to be able to benefit directly or indirectly from whatever our revenue will flow from these discoveries. I see that many persons are, and one of the things that Clinton mentioned, the strategic approach to benefiting from our revenue is a very important thing, and I find that many persons are looking to position themselves directly in the oil and gas industry. So some of my colleagues are going to do L&M in oil and gas. I know there are several lawyers who have gone to do that, but there are a lot of satellite areas surrounding oil and gas which will not have that glut, because I think that if young people, as some of us have tended to do before, just streamlined our vision and just look at oil and gas and what is immediately in front of us, we will lose out. Because before me and Clinton were talking about whether or not there's a glut of lawyers in Guyana, one of the things I was mentioning to him is that it's not that there's excess, is that in some cases we're not maximizing the potential that exists, and there is a multiplicity of potential which exists in the oil and gas industry and the satellite industries. So don't just look to work on a rig. Do not just look to be a consultant in oil and gas and contracts or whatever the case might be. Look at occupational health and safety. Look at environmental considerations. Look at some of the technological opportunities which relate to oil and gas. If young people really want to benefit, we have to be smart and we have to qualify ourselves. Unfortunately, poverty is an issue, financing is an issue, and so you usually find that trickle-down economics usually does not tend to work. And aside from government intentionally making policies to ensure that we benefit directly from the funds which will come or flow from the oil and gas flow, we need to be able to find ourselves in employment opportunities, whether it be entrepreneurial or working with somebody else that will allow us to benefit. As I said, finance is a limitation to that. However, assuming that we're able to overcome the finance limitation, we need to position ourselves in places of employment and places of policy making and development that will allow us to benefit, and not just allow us to benefit, but also to allow others to benefit, which is why, for example, I'm interested in policy making. So it's not just using the revenue from oil and gas for immediate benefits and immediate improvements, whatever the case may be, but it's also to improve Guyana long term over a period of time to ensure that by the time we get to the end of the road, we will not have just use of the oil, use revenue, and have instant gratification, but we would have put in place provisions and mechanisms to ensure the long term success. Use some of the funding, for example, advocate for the use of some of the funding to ensure that some young people are able to go and study areas which will be beneficial to Guyana in the future, not just looking at the traditional areas of law and medicine and economics, but what are some of the technological developments? Look after the University of Guyana, seek to attract new investments in universities or scholarships for persons to study things that will benefit Guyana in the long term. When I think about youth benefiting from oil and gas, I am not just looking at the revenue from oil and gas, but I'm looking at how the revenue can lead to developments that will foster an environment in which youth can benefit long term. I don't plan to leave Guyana, at least not for a substantial period of time. I plan to stay here, and so I have considerations of whether or not my children, providing that I have them, whether they will be able to benefit from what should develop in Guyana. And so that is what I think we need to do. Strategically place ourselves to benefit directly or indirectly, but also ensure that whatever is flowing is used to develop Guyana in a way that will continue, because sustainability is the word, that will continue to benefit us, the country, and the youths to come.
All right, so Vishal, your thoughts on that, and then we have to wrap up.
All right, so I'll start first with what young people need to do in order to preserve and prepare themselves, rather. First of all, like Chevy would have mentioned, you need to look at those areas that are running alongside oil and gas. So look at your services industry. We need to start taking an approach, for example, to sectors such as agriculture, for example, looking at how we can train meat technologists, we can train persons who are truly agronomists, looking at expanding the capacity of the Guyana School of Agriculture. Then, of course, I have something that I like to call economic zoning curricula, which, essentially looks at how we can, train people in different economic areas to use those resources that are available to them and train them in specific skill sets. So people who let's say, if on the coast, you might have environmental engineers who might be more versed at dealing with water-based systems than those that you would train to work in the Rupununi, for example. And moving on from that, what we need to look at is essentially how we manage those oil revenues. And young people need to advocate for things like massive public infrastructure development projects. We must be able to drive from Lethem to Molson Creek to get over to Suriname. It must not only be one road. You need to open up all these areas. And of course, when you build these things, satellite communities will develop. We need to look at establishing investment and infrastructural development banks, where the state actually has a vested interest in public-private partnerships, all right? Because I believe that's the only thing that works. Once you have the accountability and the factor of wanting to make a profit from the private aspect, as well as the responsibility to provide from the government aspect, projects tend to work better that way. Okay. We need to look at having a common agricultural policy that looks at meshing all these semi-autonomous organizations and bodies that we have, and bringing them together to develop these areas. We need to look at not just those things, but look at services. We need to, of course, bring into play, more importantly, right, out of everything, the financial system in Guyana, because you're talking about getting into oil and gas, and Guyana still is way behind as it relates to fintech, all right, or financial technology. What happens when you have an influx of foreigners who come from, societies that are way more developed than ours, and they say, "Hey, I'm not fetching any cash around. I have my EBT card or whatever cards they use, and I just want to do points of sale." The average business in Guyana, doesn't have that, and that's simply because we don't have systems to do so. I'm not going to call the name, but a friend of mine went into a bank the other day on Regent Street, and did a transaction there. Went to the Water Street branch, and they literally had to pick up the phone to find out what happened at the Regent Street branch. Where are we in terms of technology? So, in essence, we need to look at infrastructure, whether it's related to IT and interconnectivity, whether it's relating to media, the actual physical infrastructure of getting people from place to place. All these things need to come into place. And of course, Guyana needs to look at, and I've said it, for quite a while, we are an economy that has been based on natural resources for quite some time. Yet still, we're only now looking to set up a natural resources fund, right, to channel those funds from the exploitation of natural resources into different areas. We also need to look at not just spending that money, but investing that money into other companies and countries abroad. Case in point, for example, look at how many companies on the S&P 500 that Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in. Of course, we need to look at how all these investments are sectioned off into short, medium, and long-term investments, what the rate of returns rates of return going to be for us, and not sit back and depend solely on oil and gas, but look at how we can divest all those funds into developing additional areas.
Okay, thank you so much, Vishal. All right, so we are out of time. I want to thank you, gentlemen, so very much for being on the panel with me and for being open and honest on this topic. Thank you, Clinton, to Chevy, to Vishal. Thank you all so very much. We had another question, but we're out of time, so we have to go again. Thank you all so much. And to our viewers, we thank you for tuning in every week to the program. Make sure you're tuned in next week for more discussions on issues affecting Guyana and that are of national importance. And again, to all of the fathers, a happy Father's Day. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for having me.